So Lee, anytime you see one of these groups to get together, whether it's the G7 or the G20, you think, okay, well, that's a chance for them to have constructive conversations face to face, maybe consolidate views, put out some strong statements. But when we're looking at the G7, what is its significance beyond just another meeting of its type?
Well, I don't think it has enormous significance, but still the G7, although its relative weight in the global economy has fallen substantially since when the G7 was first created during the Cold War, because of the rise of economies like China, India, Brazil, and so on, it still represents a big chunk of the world economy. And these 7 countries, they're still in the top 10 for things like overall GDP, national wealth, export, and it's 3 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. So it is still a very significant grouping and a forum for inter-elite coordination and decision-making. So even though the West is not still as dominant as it used to be, it's still a major grouping that is quite important in the global economy.
What do you think of where its focus has been versus where perhaps it should be?
Well, the focus is determined largely by whoever's in charge of the G7 in that particular year. So this year, it's the UK, and that means a focus on the climate, because that's the way that Britain is trying to use its leverage internationally to try to pull together a consensus on climate. Because obviously the UK was chairing COP26 as well, which didn't go very well. But that's why they're focusing on climate through the G7 at the moment. A lot of people would say, well, the climate is the most important thing facing mankind at the moment. There are, of course, other issues closer to home that elite might be focusing on, but that's the way the UK chooses to use its leadership at the moment.
Yeah, and you could say, though, that the G7 has been talking about a rising China for many, many, many years, but what has its plan been to either counter rising China or work with it, or, increase its own output in the face of it? It doesn't seem like there's been really a comprehensive plan, and there are lots and lots of differences of opinion within as well.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think for a long time there was an implicit strategy from the West towards China, which was bringing China into the global institutions headed by the United States, like the World Trade Organization, for example. And this would eventually lead to China modernizing and becoming more liberal. And I think it's really only in the last sort of 5 years or so that the West has really realized that this was a fantasy, and China is not moving in that direction. In fact, it's moving in the opposite direction. And so just recently, the G7 has declared the launching of so-called Build Back Better World, which is a counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative. So it's an attempt to mobilize public and predominantly private financing to offer developing countries an alternative to Chinese development financing. So they are starting to move in that direction, but it is quite slow. And it does really rely on individual countries, I think, to make the running on this. So the United States is starting to gear up its funding of infrastructure in the global south. The UK has just announced its own change in policies to try to do this. So they are gradually gearing up. But as you say, there's not 100% consensus, even within the 7 countries represented, on how to deal with China.
Of course, dealing with Russia has been another pressing issue. I mean, Russia annexed Crimea and the world watched it happen, did nothing about it. Now there's lots of concern that Russia might make another move. You would think that these countries in opposition of that would be ready to do something more, which of course nobody wants to.
Well, you have to remember that most of the G7 countries are members of NATO. It's not true to say that NATO did nothing in response to Crimea. It's massively ramped up its troop presence in Eastern Europe and takes quite a belligerent posture towards Russia. In fact, there are many people that would argue that it's NATO expansion into Eastern Europe that has actually provoked Russia first into intervention in Georgia in 2008 and then subsequently into Ukraine in 2014. So I don't think it's that these countries have done nothing. And my understanding is that about 90% of Russian military assets are essentially pinned down in Ukraine, and they couldn't advance any further if they wanted to. So I'm not quite sure your characterization is correct.
Well, they've done something in response. Did they establish the relationships and the cooperation to prevent it? No. But Lee, thanks so much for your input. Really appreciate your insights.